can't believe it's taken me this long to finally watch Coco, but it was totally worth it, and I think I'm gonna need to see my own therapist after this.
I think there's this idea of generations and families just accepting the status quo in the name of solidarity and connection, when I don't actually think that's what true connection really means. And I think Coco wonderfully depicts how blind acceptance for the status quo can actually hurt us more than it helps us in the long run. And it takes a really brave individual to challenge that status quo for true healing and connection to actually happen. A lot of people think that the hardest part of healing comes in the thick of all the processing and the grief, but I truly think that the most courageous thing is. Hi everyone, I'm Jacqueline. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist, and today we're going to be talking about the family dynamics in Coco, including identity formation, grief, and intergenerational trauma. So, if you're interested, make yourself a little cozy drink and keep watching. At the beginning of the story, we're introduced to the Rivera family, who really stands out from the rest of their community because of how much they hate music. And they've really solidified and grounded their identity in being generations of talented shoemakers to make up for the fact that Mama Coco's dad abandoned her to play music when she was really young. Since then, the family committed to never speaking of or having to do anything with music. And what I thought was really interesting off the bat was this concept of cutoff being very apparent in the movie. In therapy, this idea of cutoff is when an individual decides to distance themselves from certain family members, and this can look more like the stereotypical cutoff where they decide to never speak to them again, never see them again, or it can be more of like an emotional cutoff where maybe they're still seeing that family member here and there, but they try not to be too emotionally attached to that individual. And in Coco, we can see that the whole family, generations of this family, has cut themselves off from not a person, but a thing that represents the pain that that person has inflicted upon their family.
No music. No music. No music.
And although we kind of get a sense as to why the Riveras hate music so much, there's still a little bit of mystery as to who this guy is and what happened to him after he left his family to play music. And I think this intentionally ambiguous story is what keeps us as viewers and the family members in a very tunnel visioned idea that this dad or this great great grandfather is a one-dimensionally evil character. So when we meet the main character, who's a 12-year-old little boy, Miguel, who's the only one who really challenges this idea that music is evil, that music is bad, we really start to see what happens when one family member starts to divert from the status quo. In family therapy, we kind of understand this idea that family systems create very predictable patterns or cycles within that family system that kind of keeps the folds of those families together, whether that system be healthy or unhealthy. And when something or someone decides to challenge that very well kept system, there's going to be a lot of pushback from that family to keep the system the same as it always was, to keep that predictability. There's this deep part of Miguel that he's really not able to share with his family despite how much he loves them, knowing that he won't be accepted by them if he were to share that part with them. So when his abuelita finds him playing the guitar on the streets, she immediately runs to the assumption that this man has wrongly influenced her precious grandchild, when it's really obvious to us that he's been playing music for years. Miguel really seems to be at this exploratory and maybe a little bit rebellious stage of his life, where he's starting to differentiate what his interests are apart from his family's. And this is a very well understood part of developmental psychology, where we're essentially meant to overcome certain struggles or certain questions at different points in our life. And in adolescence, we go through what's called identity versus role confusion, which is what we really see happening with Miguel here. And during adolescence, we're faced with the task of figuring out who we are and what our place in the world is meant to be. And I think more than just loving music, it speaks to his desires to know, where do I come from? Who am I? And where do I belong? And when we're unable to gain a better sense of ourselves, that can lead to a lot of feelings of aimlessness and impact our ability to make certain choices for ourselves in the future. And this is where we see adults who really struggle to make decisions for themselves and can be really indecisive. They constantly turn to other people for validation that they're making the right choice and are really heavily impacted and influenced by what other people think about their choices in their life. With the Riveras, they seem to have a strong and united front with each other, and they hold strongly to the value that family and tradition is everything. And I definitely see this happen a lot, especially with interdependent families or cultures, which are essentially cultures that value the greater good of the group and the community or the family over the needs of the individual. And I definitely don't claim to be an expert on Mexican culture, given that I am not from that culture. But just speaking more broadly about interdependent cultures, individuals are more likely to kind of shift their own values or thinkings to fit the group and to create almost this idea of oneness and unity. For example, we see the Riveras' whole extended family living and working with each other in this beautiful family business, which is what makes their bond so close and strong. They're also kind of united by this idea of music being evil and shoemaking being the escape from their pain. But when traditions are forced upon one another at the cost of individuality, it leads to all the other problems that we see, such as lack of individual thinking, resentment, and distance.
But I don't wanna pick sides. Why can't you be on my side? That's what family's supposed to do. Support you. But you never will.
And what I thought was interesting was when Miguel asked his family what really happened, no one was really able to answer his question. And that to me was kind of the first sign that maybe we don't know the whole story about his great great grandfather.
Ernesto de la Cruz, the greatest musician of all time.
We've never known anything about this man. But whoever he was, he still abandoned his family.
And I think that really goes to show how groupthink within certain family systems or community really solidifies a lot of misunderstandings and pain. If just one person had questioned this narrative earlier on, or even that the family made it so that a person could question this narrative, a lot of this misunderstanding maybe could have gotten cleared up a little bit earlier. But instead, we see what happens when someone dares to question the very fabric of the Riveras foundation, as Miguel is shunned and berated by his family for even questioning what happened. So then this leads him to run away from his family, where he finds himself being transported to the land of the dead, and he quickly realizes that he's gonna die there unless he gets his ancestors' blessings to go back to the land of the living. Except Miguel can't catch a break because he realizes, damn, my dead ancestor family also hates music for some reason. And I thought it was really fun to see how their hatred for music transcends life and death. I think it really solidified how strong that cutoff was to music and to this great great grandfather that we still don't know a whole lot about. And I think the way that they've hardened themselves is twofold. On one hand, we get to see what happens when people get stuck in the anger stage of grief for too long. And while anger is a really important step to help us grieve and process difficult things, when we're unable to process that anger in a productive way, it really results us in being hardened and closed off to things that could actually bring us a lot of joy, such as music. And the second part of this is how their forced conformity is what ultimately perpetuates the intergenerational trauma within their family. They think that they're protecting themselves from one thing when they're really perpetuating pain and lack of healing. You know, this kind of idea of accepting things for the way that they are because that's how things have always been done. And that can be really harmful because it really disconnects us from our own personal values and lacks real empathy and connection. A big example of that I see in therapy all the time are parents who expect their children to just forgive them for all their shortcomings when they were a kid, because that's what the parents were expected to do when they were kids. There's almost like this childlike unfairness that gets stirred up in the parents, and they just really struggle to understand, why can't my child do what I had to do for my parents? When I hear those kind of narratives, there's oftentimes this deep disconnection or deep invalidation of the painful past that they had to endure with their parents. You know, they kind of had to just push through or accept the way that things were. And that's why they continue to perpetuate this idea that forgiveness for one parent should be so easy. It's because they were forced to do the impossible with their parents. And this is not to obviously excuse the behaviors of those parents. It's usually never from a place of malice or evil that they want their kids to forgive them so badly, but usually from a place of unhealed trauma and grief themselves. I love the friendship and ultimately familial love that develops between Miguel and Hector, and Hector in particular exemplifies what it looks like for a lot of people who are estranged from their families due to some misunderstanding that they're not able to confront. And this is why a lot of times in therapy, cutoff is highly discouraged when individuals do have that option to go back to their families and work things out. And in my opinion, I think this is a pretty misunderstood and controversial topic, because I don't think that going back to your family and working things out always has to mean that you go back to those family members specifically. There are obviously a lot of instances in which this isn't feasible, right? If maybe that individual has abusive family members that are very rigid in their thinking, that may never apologize or try to reconcile for what happened. And in that case, going back to one's family and working things through can just look like going to therapy, where you have that space to be able to really work through the patterns that you want to leave behind and the patterns that you want to take with you moving forward in your life. It's creating a space of intentionality and awareness so that we don't just fall into the trap of following our old patterns. But in Hector's case, he lives a lonely and isolating afterlife because he was unable to confront the mistakes and reconcile with his wife. You know, he kind of stands out from everyone else, and he's really looked down upon and treated as an outcast even in the land of the dead. His whole legacy is based on a misunderstanding, leaving generations of pain behind. And I think it's really interesting that he lived his whole afterlife with his wife, and I imagine it wouldn't have been so hard for him to find her and explain everything if he really wanted to. But I think he was so riddled with shame that it forced him into isolation. And what we do know about shame in psychology is that it actually wants us to be alone. It wants us to be isolated so that that shame can grow and to fester. And that shame feels much safer in a dark and isolated place because it doesn't expose us to the vulnerability or that possibility of being rejected by other people and for that shame to be deepened further. But what shame leads us to do is exactly the opposite of what we really need for that shame to heal. You know, in order for shame to heal, we really need to be accepted and seen by other people, especially the ones that we love the most, especially the ones that we want to hide from the most when that shame feels so prominent. And that's exactly what Hector is able to get with his relationship with Miguel. Miguel is the first one to hear what Hector has been through, the path that he's chosen, and yet to still accept him with open arms.
Proud to be his family!
I'm proud to be his family!
I think there's an interesting relationship parallel between Miguel and Hector because the very ancestors that Miguel is running away from are the very family members that Hector needs to reconnect with. You know, the relationship starts off as being very transactional, with Miguel needing Hector to take him to De La Cruz, while Hector needed someone to put his photo up on an ofrenda. But the beautiful thing is that they were able to heal something deeper in each other that they didn't even know they needed. At first, Hector's wishes seemed to be out of self-preservation and not wanting to face his final death, but we're able to see that he seeks something so much deeper. What he truly wants is to be remembered and to be loved by his family that has misunderstood him for so long. You know, I think I really applaud Hector's persistent belief in love and connection, especially after he was betrayed by his best friend in the worst way possible, and then he continued to be misunderstood by his family for generations. I think he really could have let those experiences harden himself to relationships, but instead he chose a path that ultimately led him to be reunited with his loved ones. He really reminds me of so many of my clients that come into therapy to heal that part of themselves that might have been hurt by family members or loved ones time and time again. A lot of people think that the hardest part of healing comes in the thick of all the processing and the grief, but I truly think that the most courageous thing is being willing to take that first step to heal even after all that pain that they've been through. So shout out to all of you who are in therapy or are on some kind of healing journey of your own, because I know that therapy isn't always accessible to everyone. Alright, that's it for today, guys. I definitely didn't know what I was expecting watching Coco for the first time, but I definitely was not expecting to be this emotional. And I think this happens every time I watch something Disney or Pixar related, so that was really on me for not even expecting it in the first place. Like, I guess I could have seen that one come in. But I would love to hear what other Disney shows or movies that you guys would recommend to me next.